Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us. Anna Maria, I'm just going to put you on mute for 1 second while I do the introduction. We welcome you to the PharmD and CCAF's Climate Smart Agriculture Series, prioritizing climate smart agricultural interventions at different spatial and temporal scales. Our speaker today is Dr. Ana Maria Lobo-Guerrero. And Ana Maria, afterwards you can tell me how wrong I got that. And Ana Maria is CCAF's Regional Program Leader for Latin America, and she'll be talking about reducing climate risks in Latin American agricultural sector, a tool to prioritize climate-smart agricultural interventions. This webinar is the second in our series. Today's webinar is facilitated by Frida Mikulchuk, agricultural specialist at the World Bank, and she works on climate-smart agriculture and climate and disaster resilience. My name is Rebecca Rivola, and I am assisting with the webinar. Before we proceed, I just want to give you a quick tour of the webinar space. Everybody is on mute as they enter, and this is because we want to make sure that the speaker is able to present without interruption. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, we encourage you to use the chat box feature, and you can also use the Q&A box. And we will be monitoring those questions, and we will make sure that they are a part of our discussion afterwards. If you have any questions, any tech-related questions, anything else about the webinar space, you can chat either publicly or privately with me, and Frida and I are on the same computer, so please do chat to Frida if you chat privately. The last 20 minutes of our time together will be a Q&A session with the presenter. Please do be asking questions throughout. If you don't ask a question during the presentation, you will be able to ask your question then. However, the sooner you ask your question, the more likely it is that it will be answered by the presenter. So we encourage you to ask those early on. And the last thing I want to share with you is that the webinar is going to be recorded. So we will be sharing this after this webinar concludes by email. And now I'm going to pass the microphone over to Frida to introduce Ana Maria.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to have you here today and to be moderating the discussion with Ana Maria following her presentation. Before I give the floor to Ana Maria, I will quickly provide you with her bio. So Ana Maria Lobo-Guerrero, I hope I pronounced it a little better, is the Latin America leader of the CGIR research program for climate change, agriculture, and food security, or CCAFs. She's based in Cali, Colombia. In this position, she plays a major role in partnership development to foster the scale-up and implementation of climate-smart agriculture in Latin America. Ana Maria holds a master and a PhD in economics from the University of California in Los Angeles. She has 7 years experience of working on climate change challenges. And before that, Dr. Lobo-Guerrero has also worked at the Research Department and Monetary and Reserves Department of the Central Bank of Colombia, the Research Department of the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Sustainable Environmental Development Deputy Directorate, these are long names, of the National Planning Department of Colombia in a role to coordinate climate change. Ana Maria, we will now give you the floor. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And just let me start by saying that both of you did a wonderful job in pronunciating my last name. It's a hard one, but I'm really impressed. Okay, so let me start by thanking the organizers of this webinar. I'm really happy to be with you this morning and share a little bit of the work that we have been doing in Latin America with respect to climate smart agriculture and being part of this series of the farm webinars. So let me start with my presentation. So in the following 20-25 minutes, I'm going to follow the agenda that you can see in the presentation. So talk very briefly about what CCAF is, this research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security, give you a little bit of context and background. Then I'm going to jump to talk a little bit about the challenges and why are we really into climate smart agriculture and promoting the scaling of these kind of practices and technologies. I'm going to follow by giving you an idea of what this tool that I'm presenting this morning is all about. So what we have called the Climate Smart Agriculture Prioritization Framework. So in a little bit of detail, I will tell you the methodology, and then I will follow with 3 different examples, which are really interesting because they are very different in terms of scales and in terms of interaction with different stakeholders, all of them happening in Latin America. Just let me say that this tool has been implemented around the world in the different regions from CSA, but for this morning I'm just going to emphasize on the work that has happened in Latin America, and then I'm going to finish with some key messages. So what is CSA? Is this a research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security? And it is a very interesting way of doing research because mainly the project or the program works with all the 15 sensors that are part of the CGR. So in the map, in the presentation, you can see all 15 sensors focusing on different issues, going from tropical agriculture to maize and wheat, to water, to fish, to agroforestry, to livestock, biodiversity, etc. So what we do in CSA, in this research program, is that we interact with the science that is happening in these centers, in these research centers, so that it can be useful for our next users, for decision-making processes. And when I talk about next users, I'm referring to governments at different scales, so thinking about regional, national, subnational, or local, but also I'm talking about the private sector, which is one of our main partners, also associations of producers, and also talking about farmers. So basically what we intend to do in the research program in CSA is to get all that knowledge that is being generated in these sensors and then capture that knowledge and putting in a way in products that can be useful for decision-making processes in these next users. The idea at the end of the day is to generate high-quality scientific products that can support decision-making in rural communities when thinking about the impact of a changing climate. So now let's move a little bit to climate smart agriculture. So in CSA, we are all about climate smart agriculture. And just say a few words about what climate smart agriculture is. Basically, what we intend to do with this is to do research on understanding these 3 very important pillars to address the challenge. So thinking about mitigation, reducing on greenhouse gas emissions, thinking about adaptation, and thinking about food security and productivity. But what we really try to do is to understand the synergies and the trade-off between these 3 pillars. So when you go into the communities and you start implementing these practices and technologies, what you see is that sometimes it is very hard to separate these 3 pillars. Because in the territory, there are many things that are interacting with respect to adaptation, mitigation, and food security and productivity. So that's what climate smart agriculture really does. And also understanding the context. So it's not only the technology, but understanding the socioeconomic factors, the political, the legal, the institutions, the financial mechanisms in order to scale these climate smart agriculture interventions. Also really interesting in the concept is that we go beyond the production part. So even though we do a lot of research on crops and things like that, we consider the whole food system. So going into production, but then harvesting and post-harvesting consumption, post-consumption, waste and losses. So that's something really in the heart of what climate smart agriculture is. So now let's move a little bit, I don't know what's going on. So let's move to the tool, to the climate smart agriculture prioritization tool. And here what I want to discuss is a little bit of the rationale. why from CCAP side did we decide to start elaborating this tool? And we have, when we were starting, we have two relevant stakeholders in our minds. We had the government, and from our experience working with the governments all around the world, we understood that they were looking for means to prioritize adaptation options. And somehow, a little bit of the story in here was that we realized that the list of different interventions and technologies were well known by the different stakeholders. But what they didn't know was how to prioritize, where to start. If you had a specific objectives and targets for each dollar that you would put on each one of these technologies, where you would get the maximum return. So where should you start to invest in these different practices? So somehow what we wanted to give to stakeholders in the government was a methodology that could help them to go from a shopping list, so you have all these different technologies and practices, and thinking more into portfolio. So a set of different practices implemented, and which were the synergies between these three pillars considered adaptation, mitigation, and food security. And again, where to start? Which specific portfolios should I start investing? So that was the main part, the first part of our demand analysis when we started thinking about developing this tool. The second one was related to finance. And then we said, you know, it's really important. We have all these wonderful technologies. We need resources to start implementing them. So we also realized that multilateral donors, climate finance people were looking for tools to direct their investments. So again, thinking about the opportunity cost of each dollar that these people were putting into these different initiatives, and also in ways to achieve co-benefits. So even though there were programs investing on adaptation, they were interested in knowing if they had some benefits in terms of mitigation as well. So three main issues that we wanted to address with this tool. The first one, targeting more strategic investments. And this, what we want to do this is considering agroecological areas and key production systems for food security. And also considering the three pillars, adaptation, mitigation, and productivity, but taking into account local needs. So as you will see when I tell you about the example of the implementation of this tool, this is a very flexible tool because challenges are different in the different countries, in the different regions, in the different communities. So that's really interesting about this tool, really understanding local needs and diversity. Then the second issue that we wanted to address with this tool was the one in relation to funding sources. And funding sources for what? For implementing and scaling CSA practices and policies. So based on this prioritization that happens through the tool, what we want is to direct this funding for implementation and scaling. And the third one that is really interesting and something that is, has been proven to be useful throughout the process is this dialogue across the scales between a diversity of stakeholders. So you will see the tool is very participatory, and this has been really helpful in terms of providing legitimacy to the process. So putting all stakeholders in the same room, discussing, that has been really helpful to really address the issue of implementing and scaling climate smart agriculture. So, in this slide, and you'll see that there's a lot of information, right? But basically, this, in a nutshell, this is what the climate smart agriculture prioritization framework looks like. Again, to emphasize that it is very flexible, it responds to the needs of the different stakeholders that we are working, and you will see that on the three examples that I'm going to present. And it's very participatory. So it has 4 different phases, and I'm going to go phase by phase so you can have an idea of what the methodology is. So you start phase 1, and again, remember, we acknowledge that people in general know about these different technologies, interventions, options with relation to either adaptation, mitigation, or increasing productivity. So the phase one, it's an initial assessment of all these CSA options. So basically what we do in this very first phase is that we construct some indicators considering the three pillars of the climate smart agriculture, again, adaptation, mitigation, productivity. And using these indicators, we rank this long list of CSA practices. So according to this, we have the ones that are more interesting based on these indicators. So in phase two, what we do is that we somehow make shorter this list. So through a workshop, and this is workshop number one, we identify the top CSA options. And here is very relevant the stakeholders that are participating in this workshop, because we use their experience, we use their knowledge to come up with this short list of priority CSA practices. So think about 5 to 10, so going from 30, 40, 50 in phase one, we go into having a short list of these CSA practices and programs. Then we go into phase three, and in this phase is where the economic analysis happens. And so we calculate the cost and benefits of these top CSA options. So remember that we have a list of 5 to 10, but not only a classical cost-benefit analysis. We try to include as possible, if we have the information in terms of the co-benefits in terms of externalities. So we rank again this short list considering these economic aspects and these economic factors. But this is not the end of the story, because again, from our experience, what we have seen is that there's a lot of really interesting practices in terms of economic analysis, and then they are not being implemented. So the question was, why? And then that's why we included the phase four. So we have a final workshop, workshop number two, where we have two main things that we want to accomplish in this workshop. The first one is to identify opportunities and constraints for the implementation of this short list of CSA practices. So even though they could be really interesting in terms of economic analysis, then what are the challenges in terms of implementation? For example, are there legal barriers? What are the bottlenecks? Are there cultural issues that are making it hard to implement these things? So using the information coming from the stakeholders attending this workshop, we get that information. And the second thing that we do in this second workshop is thinking about portfolios. So going beyond our thinking and analyzing practices separately. So when you implement this, what we want to address is, are there synergies? Is it different implementing only one practice or technology, or implementing a set of these, 3, 4? What's the difference in terms of the objectives, thinking about adaptation, mitigation, and productivity? So, I'm going to tell you about 3 examples where we have implemented this tool in Latin America. The first one in Guatemala, more at the national level. The second one in Tripino and Central Nicaragua, in Central America, in our climate smart villages. And the third one in the Cauca River watershed in Colombia. So before going into the specific examples, why is this tool innovative? So are we talking of classic cost-benefit analysis? I think that we are going way beyond that, and I wanted to put it clear why, from the perspective of CCAS, we think that this is innovative. So we are able, through the process and the tool, we're able to understand barriers and opportunities. So it's not just thinking about economic factors, but also understanding what's happening around these economic factors. Second thing, we are not only analyzing economic, but also social and environmental costs and benefits. And also that it's very relevant, we are addressing the issue of synergies. Synergies between productivity, adaptation, and mitigation when thinking about portfolios and not the implementation of single technologies and interventions one by one. And why we think that this is different, and this goes beyond a cost-benefit analysis, because of the participation of the various stakeholders from different sectors And basically our experience is that this has really contributed to make a more realistic assessment using the knowledge of these people, the knowledge that these people bring to the table. So this, before going into the specific examples, this is just to give you an idea of the different ways to implement the tool. So in here you have Guatemala in the left-hand side, and then you have Cauca, and what we did in here was the proportion or the percentage of the types of stakeholders that were participating in this process. So in Guatemala, you see most of them were from the government, 46%, followed by farmers associations, and then a little bit of research centers taking part in the exercise. In Cauca, what you see is that the story is a little bit different, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But in Cauca, the relevant stakeholders were the farmers associations, and then civil society was also really important. So again, this is just to emphasize the flexibility of the tool and that it can be adjusted to the different circumstances. So Guatemala, this was done for the dry corridor in Guatemala, and in here what you see are 3 different publications or products that were part of this process of implementing the tool. So in the first one, what you see is more on the process. So in this final report, we document everything that happened, all the 4 phases that I just discussed, and then I think that you'll have access to this presentation, and you can go click on the link, and then you can have access of all the information that has been generated with respect to implementing the tool in Guatemala. The second one was more related to the specific alternatives that were addressed, and we think that was also really relevant. And the third one is one that was published this year in Agricultural Systems Journal, and it's basically talking about the methodology of the costs and benefits, and including the externalities and everything around doing focus more on these economic aspects. So, and I'm not going to go deep into the interventions that were assessed, because I don't think that that's what we want to do here, but just for you to have an idea and a flavor of the type of results that we are obtaining from implementing the tool. So in here, what you will see is a graph. In the horizontal axis, what we are measuring is the level of impact in terms of these 3 pillars: mitigation, adaptation, productivity. So 10 being a very positive impact. So if you have a 10 in terms of mitigation, what it says is that the potential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions is high. Then 0, no effect, and you can go all the way to -10 when you have like real strong but negative effects on the 3 pillars. And then in the vertical axis, what you have are the different interventions or the different practices. So as you can see, this was really key information for stakeholders, and our partner in this exercise was the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock in Guatemala. So basically, it was key information for them to identify which were the best CSA options in order to address the 3 pillars. In here, what we did was an assessment of the co-benefits. So thinking about biodiversity, soil and water contamination, and carbon sequestration. So in the horizontal axis, what you see is in terms of money, basically. These are Guatemalan money per year. And in the vertical axis, you see the different interventions. And then the different colors, what they tell you is the different co-benefits. And so again, very useful information for national stakeholders in order to understand which were the co-benefits associated to these CSA options even before implementing them. And then this is a summary of everything that what we did in Guatemala. So it was really interesting in this case because we constructed the different portfolios from different perspectives. And here in the slide, what you see is from the farmer's perspective, from the government perspective. And even though the objective of the portfolio was the same, what was really interesting was what the specific interventions or technologies were not the same when discussing with farmers than when discussing with the government. And then what you have in the bottom part of the slide is the different indicators that you can have in order to compare the different portfolios. So you could compare in terms of total cost, in terms of net present value, internal rate of return, payback average, and then you have these very cool graphs where you can see the 3 pillars of the CSA practices, and then in terms of the additional externalities in terms of the benefits. So again, to conclude this first case of Guatemala, the MAGA, which is the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock in Guatemala, was really interesting, and basically in 2 weeks we're going to have a workshop in Guatemala using these results to work together with donors and international cooperation in order to somehow drive the investment. So given that they want to put money in Guatemala, the government now is ready to say, you know, after doing a lot of analysis, taking into account a lot of stakeholders, we decide that these are the best options for Guatemala in terms of adaptation, mitigation, and priorities. So, okay, sorry for that. So continue with the second example. So this is Trifinio and Central Nicaragua, and this is work that is happening in our climate smart villages. Work that has been done with CATIE. And here, basically what we decided to do was to, and this is a very local level work with local stakeholders, so we categorized 4 groups in order to do the assessment and to implement the tool. So we took into account agroforestry systems, then technologies and interventions related to home gardens, related to pastures and livestock, are related to basic grains. And a little bit of context of what is happening in Trifinio and Central Nicaragua. The major risks in agriculture are related to longer and intense droughts. So drought is something that is very relevant in these places, and food security is being threatened by climate. So what happened in this case? What was okay. So what happened in this case? Basically, what we did was a similar exercise in terms of considering the 3 pillars of climate smart agriculture. We did an assessment of 14 CSA practices. All of them were economically feasible in the areas that were studied. And a really interesting result was that agrobiodiversity and carbon sequestration were the highest co-benefits. The graph that you can see in there is for agroforestry systems. Remember that we have 4 systems. These are interventions for the agroforestry systems in Central Nicaragua. And what you see in the horizontal axis is the different practices, and then the impact in terms of the 3 pillars of climate smart agriculture. So very useful information for local stakeholders to see what was happening in terms of these practices in adaptation, mitigation, and food security. Sorry. So another thing that happened in this specific case in Central Nicaragua and Trifinio was that the local stakeholders said that it was very useful for them to develop this kind of cards, where they had all the information coming out from the analysis. So for each one of the practices, they had the impact on the CSA pillars. They had a description of the practice, where could it be applied, when, what practices could be complementary, thinking about these synergies and portfolios, the crops of interest, the threat phase, the barriers, the opportunities. So these proved to be very helpful for this specific case, in which they wanted to have all these assessments in a specific product that was in these cards, and they shared that with all the rest of the community. Now, moving to the third example that I want to discuss, and this happened in Colombia, in the Cauca River watershed. And what I want to emphasize in here is the type of stakeholders that interacted with us through the implementation of the methodology. So in here, we have a lot of indigenous communities being part of the exercise. And it was really interesting. Using all the information, all the knowledge from these indigenous communities, also including farmers associations, including community committees, we have a little bit of of government at the local level, at the municipality, but also intersectoral roundtables where we didn't have only people from the agricultural sector, but also from water and sanitation. So that was interesting. What happened in this example, in this specific case? Well, after reviewing all the information and the main threats, what we decided was that two sets of portfolios were going to be considered based on the main risks in this specific locality, droughts and floods. So the information that you are observing now in the presentation is the analysis for the portfolios for the drought season. So we did the same exercise for whenever we had floods, but this was for the drought season. So again, what you see are the different portfolios, then the analysis in terms of seeing how they were contributing to the three pillars of the climate smart agriculture, adaptation, mitigation, productivity, then comparing the two portfolios in terms of total cost, in terms of the cost-benefit ratios, and also in terms of the additional benefits due to externalities. So very interesting in this case how the community really engaged and they are still using this information to decide on which set of practices to implement when facing a drought season. And they're also, and then they were telling us that it was really interesting to see how they're increasing resilience. So they're affecting productivity, but at the same time they are becoming more prepared for climate change or variability. Okay, this is my last slide so we can have some time for conversation. Key messages, 4 key messages that I just want to leave. Very relevant stakeholders' involvement across the scale. So I think that one of the main things of this tool is getting information from the people that go each day to their fields, the people that work with the different communities in implementing these type of practices. So we use it to strengthen the tool. So by getting feedback from them, I think that we have a stronger tool by now after all these exercises. But mostly, we have been able to tailor the tool for a specific needs, taking into account context, taking into account objectives, taking into account needs. So this has been really interesting in terms of providing different views, thinking about a holistic approach. So that's main message number 1. Number 2, flexibility of the tool. So there are different contexts, different challenges. Not every community, country, region faces the same challenges, and basically the tool is designed to capture those specificities. Third key message, planning. So we have learned that this kind of tool or methodology is key for planning in a changing climate context. So farmers are facing a real challenge in terms of planning because they are not, the things that they used to do are not working anymore because climate is changing and it's changing faster. So by using this tool, we have been able to help communities, but also governments at different scales to plan better when facing uncertainty because of climate change. And the 4th key message that I just want to finish with is the relationship with the agroclimatic risks. So we really believe that learning how to select the most appropriate practices given current, but also thinking about future climate, considering agroecological and eco and socioeconomic characteristics is key to reduce agroclimatic risks, and it's also key to plan better for the future. So thank you very much, and I think that we are now open for discussion.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. That was a fantastic presentation. I know from our end, Frida and I have a lot of questions. So I'm going to give the floor over to Frida so she can step into her discussant role. And for those of you on the line, please do ask your questions. We would love to include them in the discussion. There are 2 ways to do that. There's a chat box function and there's a Q&A. Both of those are equally good, but please do make sure you ask your questions sooner than later. And I do see that a couple of people have raised their hands. Unfortunately, we will not be unmuting people to ask questions because we just have very limited time for the discussion. So please do use those 2 boxes. And I'm going to give this over to Frida so she can kick off the discussion. Thank you so much.
Hi all, and thanks again, Ana Maria. This was a super exciting presentation and really enjoyed it. So maybe a more general question that I would have to start with is, if you look at the broader Latin American continent, so where do you see which countries are like more open to CSA and which countries would be maybe more reluctant to taking up climate smart agriculture?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. So I think that a lot has been happening in the recent years, thinking about the Paris Agreement, thinking about the CSA Alliance, the Global CSA Alliance, and just to give you an example of what's going on in Central America. So in Central America, we are working closely with the Central American Agricultural Council, and basically what we are doing right now is that we are formulating a CSA strategy for all 8 Central American countries, including the Dominican Republic. So this was something that, if you think about 5, 6 years ago, they were not even thinking about that. And thinking about mitigation, which I think is the more controversial piece of this climate smart agriculture. So basically, I think that what has changed is that now, and through all these type of exercises, the different governments and stakeholders are understanding that there's opportunity to really do interesting things in terms of adaptation and increasing productivity, but also at the same time contributing to mitigation, to reducing greenhouse gases. So Central America, I'm so happy we are working together. They are so excited. We are finishing the strategy. We're going through consultations from all the countries, and the idea is to have some guidelines, but that they can be implemented in all of these 8 countries, including the Dominican Republic. So that's something that I think it has been really interesting happening in Central America. Colombia as well, we have been working for a while, like 4 years ago, with the Ministry of Agriculture, but also, and it's a really interesting case with what we call in Colombia the gremios, which are the producers' associations. So they are being the ones that are really leading the process about climate smart agriculture. And something really interesting that has happened is that a new roles of people in these organizations have appeared. So for instance, having an agroclimatologist, the Rice Association didn't have one. And after engaging in all these type of analysis and experiments, they have realized that it is very important that they have that. So I guess that the differences come to think about mitigation and the importance that each country is placing on mitigation, and that's where it's a little bit hard. So for instance, Nicaragua has been a little bit hard in Central America. But again, I think that by using these methodologies and realizing that we can get really interesting goals with adaptation, but at the same time with mitigation in terms of promoting productivity in the agricultural sector, that has helped a lot. So yeah, I will stop there.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Ana Maria. We have a question from Jonathan Wadsworth. And he's asking how you derive the specific scores for possible interventions in the different locations in terms of productivity, adaptation, and mitigation. Okay, so I talk about this first phase in which we use indicators. So basically, we do an assessment of if we are talking at the national level of the country, if we are talking more at the local level or the watershed, whatever, we do an analysis of the main threats with respect to climate change and climate variability, and then also getting information of the type of practices that have been implemented in the past. For instance, with the Ministry of Agriculture in Guatemala, we also did an analysis of the type of practices that were in the different policies with respect to food security, for instance. So we include all that information in a first assessment. So from there, we get these long lists that I just mentioned, and then
for some of these practices, we went into the literature and we tried to get a quantitative indicators. This is not the case for all of them, and this is thinking about the 3 pillars. So for the ones that we had information, and through discussions with the stakeholders, that information was useful because you can go to the literature and then you can talk about Africa and it's not so relevant for Guatemala, so things like that. So we consider that, but when we thought that it was useful, we include those quantitative indicators coming from the literature and coming from different studies happening in the zone. But also from the indicators that we didn't have that kind of information, we engaged with the stakeholders again. And then we did some extra workshops in terms of coming out with these indicators. So those were the indicators used for this first prioritization in terms of going from the long list to the short list. So those indicators were done through that process, and then we consider the cost-benefit analysis. So what indicators plus cost-benefit analysis, and then we prioritize, and then indicators plus cost-benefit analysis plus challenges, opportunities, barriers, bottlenecks, etc. So that's the methodology by which we are deriving these indicators for the 3 pillars.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Kate, and she asked, could you elaborate on the expected time frame needed to replicate its use in new locations? So basically, I guess, the learning process, the time frame needed to do the prioritization, and how long it would take then to learn from it and replicate it elsewhere.
So that's a really good question, and thank you for the question. So I was, I think, emphasizing a lot throughout my presentation, maybe too much, about the flexibility of the tool, and this is one example of that flexibility. So when we started developing this tool, so we said, you know, we need the best information possible. We need to go to different sources. We need to engage a lot of people in several workshops. And then when we start interacting and implementing the tool, we realized that that was not going to be the case. And why was that? At least not in any single case. Because sometimes governments or relevant stakeholders participating needed the information sooner. And I guess that our response to this was, okay, let's work it out so we can adapt to time frames. So if you have a lot of information in the country, if it is at the national level, or if it is in a community or a state, municipality, whatever, you have a lot of information. You have a lot of time to engage with the different stakeholders, to have several workshops. That's totally fine. And then, of course, we can have, you could say, a more robust result from working on the analysis of the different types of analysis. But then you can also do something that is not as intensive in terms of getting as much information as possible, in terms of interacting so much, and you can have a shorter thing. And that's what has happened. So in Guatemala, the process was, it was the first time that we were implementing this tool in CICAS, because it was also implemented, and there are other examples in Africa and Asia, but Guatemala was the first one. And I think that we learned a lot from that, and this was a long process. I think that more than a year. But then, for instance, Trifinio and Central Nicaragua was a lot shorter. I think that was more into the 4 or 5 months, and then Cauca was 3 months. But again, it depends on the kind of information that you have. It depends. I think that's something that is really important when starting the implementation of the tool. It's sitting down with the stakeholders and really analyzing what is the decision that you want to inform by implementing the methodology. And that gives you a lot of ideas in terms of time frame, in terms of the people that should get involved. So really analyzing where do you want to get by using the tool.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you, Ana Maria. So Jonathan, who asked a question a little bit earlier, his first question was how you derive the specific scores for the interventions in the different locations. He asked a follow-up question to that question. He asked, so is it largely literature-based with local opinions? I guess like literature-based plus local opinions. And then he asked, do you measure what happens subsequently, for example, in practice in the field? So that's a follow-up on that one. And then he had a second question, and I think I'll just ask both of those at the same time. His second question was, how do you explain some standard agricultural practices like pest and disease control or crop nutrition as being climate-smart agriculture? I'll leave you with those.
Sorry. So I hope that I'll remember all of them. If I forget something, just remind me, please. So in terms of the, I guess, balance between literature review and between local knowledge. So we basically, and again, I don't want to sound that I say all the time it depends, but if there's a lot of, like for instance, if you go into the literature review and you have numbers but are not really close to the case where we are working, then we don't use as much that literature, that information coming from literature, because it's only going to add noise to the exercise. But again, if you go and then you see that there's a lot of literature that is really related with the characteristics, agroecological zones, that are happening in the place that you are implementing this, then it's good, and we use as much as we can hide from that. But even though if there are good studies that are really related to the case, we rely a lot on local knowledge, because we think that really believe that information is key, and mostly thinking about implementation. So again, there are some studies, and then some studies don't take into account this context that I was discussing in terms of socioeconomic factors, in terms of barriers of legal, political, institutional. So we rely a lot on that as well. So I guess that if there's good information from the literature, we use it. If we feel that it's not so good, then we don't use it as much, and we rely more on local knowledge. So that was the first question I think that you asked. Then you asked about traditional climate practices such as pests and diseases, and then how you, I guess that the question is how you think about climate smart agriculture. Okay, how do you explain some standard agricultural practices as being climate smart? So there's something interesting about climate smart agriculture, and it's not, I mean, something that in one specific place you could classify as being climate smart agriculture, in another place could be not as much climate smart agriculture as was in the first place. And that's why the context, again, I emphasize the context is really relevant when thinking about climate smart agriculture. So things that have been successful in terms of adaptation, mitigation, increasing productivity, in some specific cases could not be as successful under other characteristics. And the interaction between the technologies and these socioeconomic, legal, institutional factors is what is really key when trying to implement massively these climate smart agricultural practices. So that's something really important to take into account when talking about climate smart agriculture. And also it's not black and white. That's also another thing about climate smart agriculture. It's hard to say this is not at all climate smart agriculture, and there are different degrees. So this could be more climate smart agriculture and more towards increasing productivity, and this could be more towards increasing mitigation and adaptation. So and thinking about traditional agricultural practices such as pests and diseases, it depends again. So pests and diseases are really interesting in terms of increasing productivity, of course, if you can manage them. But then how you manage these pests and diseases, and then you could think about compost. So if you compare compost with traditional fertilizers, then you are reducing greenhouse gas emissions compared to that business as usual scenario. So I guess that the invitation is to really analyze the specificities of the different interventions, and there is where you can find your climate smart agriculture. And I have a second one, if Jose can help me.
You answer the two.
Yeah, but I think that the one in the middle, remove the concept. So, could you repeat the second question, please?
Yeah, Anna Maria, thank you. The question was, how do you explain some standard agriculture practices like pesticide control or crop nutrition as being climate smart? And maybe related to this, if I may, that was what we were asking ourselves. If you talk to different types of stakeholders and also with indigenous people, so they may have a different knowledge background and a different understanding of concepts, of typology. So how would you explain these practices and concepts, according to the respective stakeholder group?
Okay. So that's a key question. That's a really interesting one. And basically, what we try to do with the tool is to really make the best use of that information coming from the local communities. In the case of Cauca, coming from the indigenous people. So I'm trying to engage in a conversation between what we, like scientists, do in terms of our forecasting, for instance, trying to see what is going to happen using models, using climate models, using crop models, and then doing some kind of agroclimatic forecasting. So trying to engage in a conversation between that type of knowledge and all the knowledge that they have, for instance, that the indigenous communities have. And something really interesting that happened in Cauca, in this place that we implemented the tool, was that they had these bioindicators. So you know specific things about nature. So when animals move a specific way, they say that they are going to rain, and this comes from a long observations of these different things happening. So what we did also in this exercise was to confront and to see what was happening in terms of the forecasting using models and in terms of the bioindicators. And that was included. That was included as one of the key things in thinking how to manage agroclimatic risk using these bioindicators, but combined with these models to make them more strong and robust. So that's an example on how this interaction happen with specific communities such as indigenous people. But then I'll have to say that these people are the ones that are going to be implementing these CSA practices, and the more that they feel comfortable with the information that is coming out from the analysis, and that they don't feel that these are numbers that are coming from nobody knows where, that they feel that it's a process that they have been part of, that they have a say on the process, that they relate to this analysis. I think that the more that you do that, the more that you will have a higher chance of implementing successfully these portfolios. So again, I think that we really emphasize here the stakeholder interaction. And as much as they want to be leaders, for us, the best thing to do is that they become really the leaders of the process. And a little bit that was what happened in Guatemala. In Guatemala, we started interacting with the people from the climate division of the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock. And they started learning about the tool, and they got really excited about it. And at the end of the day, they were the ones that were leading all the different phases that were happening. And I think that this was key for really, so that they could really use the results for the decision-making process. So I'll say that the more that we can interact with stakeholders, the more that they can become leaders of the process, the best in terms of implementing these portfolios.
Thanks. I think that really helped. So we have a couple of more questions, and looking at the time, we have only 6 minutes left. So maybe we can try to keep the answers a little short to get as many questions as possible asked, if that's okay for you. So we had one more question. How would you measure the climate change impact of adopted interventions? And I think it was very close to another question, or yeah, maybe we start with this. So how would you measure the impact of interventions?
Okay, so yeah, I'll try to be concise. I'm sorry about that. I really like the topic, so I get excited. And that was the question that I was missing. Yeah, I remember that you said something around those lines. So climate change impact of adopted. So that's really key because that's the climate component of what is happening here. So what happens if you implement a portfolio and then there's a drought, there's a flood? So a little bit of that was considered, for instance, in the Cauca example, that we have different portfolios according to the different climate phenomena that was happening. So I think that was part of the story. The second part of the story is that we engage into ex ante and ex post assessment. And basically, in some cases, what we did was interventions or practices that were already implemented. And then we analyzed those interventions considering the climate variable. So that was really key in terms of seeing if they were successful or not. For the ones that have not been implemented, it's a little bit harder because you have to wait. Yeah?
It's Rebecca. So sorry to interrupt. Can you speak a little bit further away from the microphone? Somehow I think you got really close to it, so it's quite difficult to understand. Here, can you say something now? Ana Maria?
I can hear you. Can you hear me well?
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Okay. I think in the last question you were just very close, so it was difficult to understand, but I can hear you perfectly now. So I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, don't worry. So what I was just saying is you can see what has happened in terms of already implemented practices when you have, for instance, droughts or floods, and it's a good way to assess how the portfolios are performing. In the ones that we hadn't had the interventions happening, so it's hard to see what is going to happen when you have these different climate phenomena. And then this is not the tool that is addressing that, but a lot of the studies that we are doing within CCAP is trying to do an assessment in general of different interventions, and that has been work that we have been doing in local communities with our climate smart villages, and doing this assessment using other kind of indicators, using other kind of models. So that's something that is being complemented. It's not in this one, in this tool that I'm presenting, unless, and in some examples we have doing the ex ante. So it's really practices that have been already implemented, and that we do the analysis of what had happened to those practices whenever you have, for instance, floods or droughts.
Okay, thank you, Ana Maria. We just have a couple minutes left, and we still have a few questions, so maybe we can do like a lightning round. We did have a quite general question from a colleague in India asking if you have any recommendations for a very large and diverse, agriculturally diverse country like India. I guess just like how would you even start looking at CSA on a country context in such a diverse place, if you have like maybe a tip to offer there. And then we had one last question related to food waste and food redistribution, and that question is regarding whether or not you are looking at how to redistribute food instead of just looking at how to produce more food. So maybe I'll leave you with those two questions, and then if you want to provide some final thoughts as well, that would be wonderful.
Okay. So with respect to the first one, India is a very interesting case, and CCAP has been doing a lot of things in India. So these climate smart villages that I have mentioned several times, which is basically places where we work with the community to generate evidence on these CSA practices and technologies, a lot of that has been happening in India. And for instance, something that has started to work really well is agricultural insurance, index insurance in India. So working together researchers with different stakeholders, for instance, from the private sector, and making the insurance more accessible to many farmers. So if you go to CCAP's webpage, you can find a lot of information of things that are happening in India. in a more general sense, we have something that has been called the CSA profiles. And also, if you go into CCAP's website, you can see all these profiles happening in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa. And it's a really good way to start thinking about how to implement CSA practices in technologies in these different countries. With respect to food waste, I think that this is really key. If you add up all the numbers coming from food waste and losses, and if you consider this a country, then this would be the third country in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases, thinking about the food system. So that's something that's really important, and CCAP, it's also up to the challenge. So starting the second phase of CCAP, that is starting this year in 2017, what we are trying to do is to come up with tools, with methodologies of really assessing what's happening in terms of all the food system. So not only doing research along the lines of production and productivity, but going beyond that. And that includes linking farmers to markets, but also includes what is happening in urban places where this food is being consumed. So great question. And just to close then, because you asked me to close, to give some last thoughts, I think that it's very interesting what has been happening in terms of CSA, in terms of climate smart agriculture, but I think that we need to go beyond a name, and as you see, the concept is very flexible, and the invitation of the concept is to really not think of technologies as being, if you could say, in a vacuum, but thinking about technologies with people, with socioeconomic factors, with many institutional challenges. Because I think that that's the only way that we could really get to implementing massively these practices. So again, participatory ways of doing research. We have been engaged a lot into that, taking into account knowledge from local people that are the ones that are going to be implementing that, making them the leaders of the process. I think that those are key issues to consider when really trying to implement climate smart agriculture in a broader sense. Remember, there's a lot of things that can be said as climate smart agriculture, but the importance is, I think the most important part is to think about this context.
Okay, wonderful, Ana Maria. There was that one last question about food waste. If you have something very short to offer there, and then we've had a really great Q&A, so we'll probably wrap it up after that.
So the last question about food waste?
The question was about whether or not you've also been looking at food waste and food redistribution in addition to increasing production as well. So like how can you also like incorporate a layer, like a lens of increasing access to food that already exists by vulnerable versus just producing?
Yeah. So we have been doing that as well. So not only considering production, but also considering the whole food system. So what has been called the food system. And as I was telling you, we're starting in CCAP to develop methods and tools that can help us to assess those things that go beyond the production side of things.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Ana Maria, we are a couple minutes over. We're 3 minutes over, but I think it was worth it because you had so many stories and examples to share.
And
thank you so much for taking the time. Do you have any final words?
No, I guess that thank you very much for having me here. It was great to hear all the questions. And if you want more information, feel free to email me, go into CCAP's website. There is a lot of things that you can see in there. We have the CSA guide that it's also has a lot of information. So thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you again for your time. It's been a true pleasure. To all the participants still on the line, we will be sharing the recording of the webinar. 1 second, we'll be sharing the recording of the webinar and as well as the PowerPoint if that's okay with you, Ana Maria.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, perfect. I hope everybody has a great day or night wherever they are in the world. And we hope you'll join us for the next webinar series.
Yeah, also from my side, this is Rita. Many thanks for your presentation. I thought this was super insightful, I think, for us and for the audience. I'm pleased to say we had more than 45 participants globally. So I think this is a very great turnout. And again, as Ana Maria said, there's a lot of valuable information on the CCAP's website. And we're also happy to provide information if needed. So have a great day, all of you.
Thanks again.